Judge Judy tries to embarrass Jasmine Crockett on live TV. She wasn't ready for the clapback when Judge Judy tried to corner Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett during a live legal panel she expected to expose weakness. But what happened next stunned everyone watching and flipped the entire conversation on its head. The cameras were already rolling when the tension hit the room like a jolt of static. It was supposed to be a civil legal panel, a special televised segment titled Law, Order, and the Constitution. Today, recorded in front of a live audience at the Winspear Opera House in Dallas, Texas, the organizers had flown in some of the most recognizable names in law and politics, but everyone knew who the real draw was. Judge Judith Sheindlin, better known to America as Judge Judy. She didn't need an introduction. Her voice carried decades of courtroom grit, and her scowl alone could silence a room. At 81, she was sharper than most people half her age, and she came ready. Sitting 3 seats down from her, wearing a crisp navy blazer and an unshaken expression, was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the freshman lawmaker from Texas's 30th District. Had spent years working as a public defender before entering the political spotlight. Younger, quieter, but no less confident. She sat, poised hands, folded eyes, direct. She wasn't there to make noise, she was there to speak truth. The panel kicked off with small talk and polite remarks. The moderator asked about the role of the judiciary in modern politics, and everyone gave their usual polished answers. That is until Judge Judy leaned in. She glanced at Jasmine like a school teacher testing a new student. Congresswoman Crockett, she began voice cutting. You speak often about justice reform, but tell me, how many felony cases have you personally tried in court? Real court, not the kind with sound bites and press conferences. There were chuckles, the kind that hover between nervous and amused. Jasmine didn't blink quite a few. She replied, including 3 capital murder cases and dozens involving illegal searches, coerced confessions, and juries that didn't reflect the people being judged. Judge Judy raised an eyebrow. Were you successful? I kept innocent people out of cages. So, yes, I was. Jasmine said that wasn't the answer. Judy expected she leaned back for a beat, tapping her index finger against her chair's armrest. The moderator tried to shift to a new question, but Judy wasn't finished. Well, it's easy to criticize the system. She continued, but I find that people without decades of courtroom experience tend to have a lot to say, and very little weight behind it. I've been doing this longer than you've been. Alive law isn't theory. Congresswoman, it's muscle memory, it's logic. Not slogans, the audience murmured. One guy in the front row actually leaned forward like he was watching a boxing match. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Her voice remained calm. With respect, Judge. She said, I know the law because I've been forced to use it as a shield, not just as a tool. It's not just logic, it's lived experience. People don't fear theory. They fear what happens when the law forgets who. It's supposed to serve that. Line hit. Not dramatic, just solid. Judge Judy smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Well, she said, we'll see how that experience holds up under real scrutiny. The moderator gave a polite laugh. Sensing the spark had become flame, he turned to the audience with a question about Supreme Court rulings. But by then everyone was focused on just 2 people. But Crockett wasn't finished yet, and what came next would turn the entire conversation on its head. You could almost feel the air change. The live audience, made up of law students, journalists, academics, and a handful of political junkies, had gone from polite interest to full alert. Judge Judy had thrown the first punch. Crockett had sidestepped it with calm precision. But everyone could sense something building. The moderator, trying to recover, redirected the conversation. Let's talk about the Fourth Amendment, he said, glancing nervously between the 2 women. There's been ongoing debate about unlawful search and seizure, especially in marginalized communities. Congresswoman Crockett, do you have thoughts on how the law should adapt? Jasmine adjusted the mic in front of her. The law doesn't need to adapt. It needs to be obeyed, she said plainly. The Constitution already prohibits illegal searches. The issue is enforcement and the lack of consequences. When those lines are crossed, that struck a chord. There was a subtle shift in posture from the law students in the back. They leaned forward. Phones were discreetly raised. Someone was already live streaming, but Judge Judy didn't appreciate the answer. She jumped in before the moderator could pivot again. Respectfully, she said, with a practiced calm, you're making it sound like the justice system is built to hurt people. That's not true. It's messy, but it's fair. Most of the time when people run into legal trouble, it's because they broke the law. There, it was the assumption. Jasmine had heard 100 times before she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Most of the time Jasmine repeated, but not all. I defended a 17-year-old in Little Rock who got stopped for walking down the street too, slowly suspicious, loitering. They called it, they found no drugs, no weapon. but he spent 2 nights in jail. Because the arresting officer didn't like his tone, the audience shifted again. I represented a woman whose apartment was raided because her neighbor got the wrong unit number in a tip line. They found nothing but left her toddler barefoot in a hallway while they tore her living room apart. She was too scared to file a complaint. A murmur of disbelief rolled through the room. Jasmine kept going. You think that's rare, but it's not. I've watched judges sign warrants with one eye on the clock. I've seen prosecutors treat poverty as proof of guilt. I'm not speaking from theory, Judge. I'm speaking from 10 years of real people and real consequences. Judge Judy narrowed her eyes. Do you believe the law can be impartial? I believe the law is only as impartial as the people who enforce it, Jasmine replied, and I believe we pretend objectivity exists more often than we practice it. The room quieted again for a moment. There was nothing but the hum of the overhead lights and the sound of someone's camera clicking from the back row. One woman in the third row. A retired teacher from Abilene whispered to the man next to her, "She's not wrong." The man nodded. I've never heard anyone say it like that. Not on live TV. Meanwhile, Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other. She was calculating her reputation. Wasn't just built on being sharp. It was built on winning. She knew how to frame questions, how to push people off balance. But something about Jasmine's presence was different. It wasn't that she came to win, it was that she came with nothing to prove. That calm certainty was harder to rattle than raw arrogance. The moderator tried again. Congresswoman Crocker, are you suggesting the system is broken? She looked directly at him. I'm saying the system was designed by people and like people, it reflects their biases unless we force it not to. But Judy wasn't about to let the conversation end there, because if she couldn't silence Jasmine with pressure, she'd try something sharper. Legal specifics. There was a stillness in the air that followed Jasmine's last statement. It reflects their biases, unless we force it. Not to, not angry, not performative, just said like a fact, and somehow that carried more weight than a shout ever could. Judge Judy, unflinching, leaned in again. Her tone was cooler, now more focused. All right, Congresswoman, she said. You're clearly passionate, but passion and precision aren't the same. Let's get specific. Tell me what federal case in your experience best illustrates the point you just made about enforcement, failing to reflect the law. The moderator blinked. He wasn't expecting that. A few audience members murmured that was Judy's signature move trap. Someone in public with a question meant to expose what they don't know. But Jasmine didn't hesitate. I'll give you one, she said. United States v. Jones, 565 U.S. 402, 0 and 12. Decided by the Supreme Court, Judge Judy looked mildly surprised. She didn't expect a citation with volume and page number. In Jones, the government installed a GPS tracking device on a suspect's vehicle without a valid warrant. Jasmine continued. They tracked him for 28 days. The D.C. Court of Appeals ruled it was an unlawful search under the Fourth Amendment. The Supreme Court agreed. She turned slightly in her chair so she could face Judy directly. But here's the part. People missed the ruling, didn't just say the tracking was illegal. It reminded law enforcement that physical intrusion, no matter how small, can't bypass constitutional rights. She paused for a moment, just long enough for people to process. In courtrooms across the country, we see police overreach justified by good faith, as if ignorance of the law is suddenly acceptable when it's the state violating it. But Jones reminds us that technology doesn't rewrite our protections, it strengthens the need for them. Now she had the audience in the palm of her hand. Judge Judy's lips tightened. It was clear she knew the case, but she hadn't expected Jasmine to know it so well, or to break it down with that level of clarity on the spot. And in front of a national audience, someone from the legal podcast row in the back leaned over and whispered, "She came ready. Jasmine wasn't done. I had a client in Texarkana." She added, "who got pulled over for a busted taillight. No warrant, no probable cause. Officer said he smelled marijuana. They tore his car apart, found nothing but. He missed 3 days of work and couldn't make rent. His kids ate noodles for 2 weeks. You won't find that in court transcripts, but it's real. Every day." Judy's eyes narrowed, and you're comparing that to Jones. That's a constitutional ruling, not a sob story. I'm connecting the two, Jasmine replied, because rulings like Jones mean nothing. If the people affected don't even know they have rights. Legal decisions don't change lives unless someone stands in that courtroom and says this is what the Constitution promises, and you can't ignore it just because he's poor or scared or inconvenient. A round of applause started from the left side of the auditorium. It wasn't thunderous, but it was real, and it grew. Judge Judy raised her hand to settle the audience. She smiled but tightly. That's a fair interpretation. But the law is about balance. We can't vilify law enforcement every time they make a judgment call. Not every time Jasmine agreed, but we can hold them accountable when those calls destroy lives. That's not vilification. That's the law doing its job. For a moment, the room was suspended between two minds, the legacy of a courtroom icon and the force of a new legal voice that had just earned respect, not by shouting, but by knowing her ground and refusing to surrender it. But Judge Judy wasn't finished, not yet. If case law didn't shake Jasmine, maybe real-world courtroom dynamics would. And so, she shifted again this time, aiming at the heart of how law is practiced. Judge Judy sat upright again, brushing the sleeve of her jacket as if wiping off dust. Her expression didn't reveal much, but her silence spoke louder than her questions for just a moment. It looked like she was recalculating. Then came the pivot. "All right," she said smoothly. "Let's move away from theory and precedent. Let's talk about the courtroom. Tell me, Congresswoman, how many times have you had to manage a hostile jury? Have you ever stood alone, no co-counsel, and watched 12 people already convinced your client was guilty before you even opened your mouth?" The tone wasn't sharp this time. It was slower, more personal. It had the subtle ring of challenge, but also a test. The kind an old warrior gives a younger one, not to break them, but to see if they belong. Jasmine didn't flinch. "Yes," she said plenty of times. "One case stands out, a young man in Garland accused of armed robbery. He had a public defender before me, who barely spoke to him by the time I got the case." The jury had been seated and the narrative was already baked in. She leaned forward slightly, not for drama, but because she was remembering it, clearly. They looked at him like he was a statistic. He had face tattoos he wore, hand-me-down clothes. But no one stopped to ask why the surveillance footage didn't match the height of the man they arrested, or why the only eyewitness was someone who cut a deal on an unrelated case. Now the audience was hooked again, so I got up there. Jasmine continued and I told them, "You don't have to like the way he looks. You just have to be honest about the evidence." I walked them through every frame of the video. I showed them how shadows distort shapes. I questioned the officer until he admitted he never confirmed the alibi the kid gave during booking. She paused, and when the verdict came back, not guilty, the judge didn't say a word. The jurors wouldn't look me in the eye, but my client. He cried not because he was free, but because someone finally believed him enough to fight. The audience was still. You could hear someone shift in their chair. 3 rows back, Judge Judy tapped a finger to her chin. That's admirable, but public defenders don't always have the luxury of time and resources. "No," Jasmine said, "we don't." But that's the point. When the odds are against you and you still tell the truth, that's when the law matters most. She looked around the room, locking eyes with a few people who had been quiet the whole time. I've seen prosecutors ignore exculpatory evidence because it slowed down their calendar. I've seen judges roll their eyes when I ask for time. To explain legal rights to a teenager who's scared and alone, that isn't justice, that's machinery. A law professor from Southern Methodist University turned to a student beside him and whispered, "She's not performing, she's testifying." Judge Judy adjusted her posture. Her voice came back softer than before. "And where is that young man now? Welding school in Waco?" Jasmine said with a small smile, "Sent me a photo when he got his first paycheck that landed." It wasn't about winning anymore. The audience knew it. This wasn't 2 lawyers trading barbs. It was one woman saying, "I've seen the flaws and still believe this system can be forced to work." And another perhaps surprised, finding a quiet respect for that belief. Judge Judy didn't clap back, not right away. Instead, she took a sip of water, then gave a faint nod. Not of agreement, but of acknowledgement. It was the first visible shift in her since the segment started. The moderator, sensing the tone had changed, leaned back in his chair. "We've covered legal theory, courtroom experience, and systemic gaps," he said. "Before we move on, anything either of you wants to add?" Judy looked over at Jasmine. "I may not agree with everything you've said," she said, "but you've earned your seat here. That's clear." Jasmine didn't gloat. She just replied, "Appreciate that." But while the live panel moved forward, cameras outside the room were already telling a different story, because clips from the exchange were starting to hit social media, and the world watching had a lot to say by the time the panel wrapped up, and the crowd began to shuffle out of the Windsor Opera House. Jasmine Crockett's name was already trending online. Not for a gaffe, not for some flashy performance, but for clarity under pressure, and the rare moment when Judge Judy herself had stepped back. Not out of defeat, but respect. But for many, watching those clips now flooding X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, one question kept coming up: who is Jasmine Crockett, and where did she come from? To answer that, you'd have to go back a few years before the Hill. Before national interviews, before microphones and press passes, you'd have to go back to a 2-room law office in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. It wasn't glamorous. It shared a wall with a laundromat and had a busted vending machine that ate more dollars than it gave back sodas. But for Jasmine, that little office was everything. It was where she learned how to be still in chaos, how to listen, and most importantly, how to fight her first major case. There wasn't even one she wanted. It was assigned to her after another public defender quit mid-trial. A 15-year-old boy was accused of assaulting a security guard at a school basketball game. Everyone had already written him off. No one wanted to deal with a minor who refused to speak above a whisper. But Jasmine did. She spent hours talking to him, not grilling, just talking, and slowly it came out. The guard had called him a name he couldn't repeat out loud without choking up, and when the boy tried to leave, he was slammed to the ground and cuffed. No one had checked the surveillance tape. Jasmine did. The guard had pushed the boy first. That tape didn't just change the verdict, it changed how Jasmine practiced law. From that moment on, she promised herself, never assume the story ends with the police report. She became the kind of lawyer other public defenders leaned on, not because she was loud, but because she did the work. No one saw the client home, visits the after-hours courthouse file, pulls the long phone calls with parents who had given up hope. And it took a toll. There were nights she slept in her car outside the courthouse because the drive back to her apartment was too long, and court was too early. There were mornings she showed up in the same clothes as the day before and hoped no one would notice. Some did, but the clients didn't care because she showed up. Eventually, her work caught attention beyond Pine Bluff. After moving to Dallas and launching her own practice, she started handling civil rights cases, many involving wrongful arrests and unlawful search suits. She didn't look for headlines. She looked for patterns. She noticed how often the same neighborhoods appeared. In complaints, how certain judges never granted bond, how some public defenders were juggling over 100 active cases at a time. She brought those stories with her when she ran for office. People underestimated her, then too said she was too young, too blunt, not connected enough. She knocked on every door in her district anyway. She showed up at fish fries, barbershops, and union halls, not to promise anything flashy, just to say, here's who I am. Here's what I know. I want to help fix what I've seen. She won, and even in Washington. She didn't let the spotlight soften her edge. She sat on judiciary subcommittees, dissected legislation word by word, and didn't shrink when older lawmakers tried to shut her out of conversations. She never forgot that kid in Pine Bluff, or the boy in Texarkana, or the woman with the toddler in the hallway. That's why when she faced off with Judge Judy under the glare of live cameras and a crowd full of skeptics, she didn't blink, because she'd faced tougher rooms with no applause, no microphone, just a stack of public records, and a client counting on her to speak when they couldn't. But while Jasmine's past told the story of her strength, the internet was just waking up to her present, and what happened next would spark a national conversation far beyond that. Dallas staged by the following morning, clips of the panel had flooded every major platform. A 37-second video of Jasmine calmly breaking down. United States v. Jones had already hit 3 million views. People weren't just sharing it, they were dissecting it. Some called it a turning point, others a fluke, but Judge Judy. She wasn't ready to call it anything, just yet, not publicly, privately. Though she wasn't thrilled in her dressing room, after the panel, she was quiet, not angry, just reflective for decades. She had built a reputation on always being the sharpest person in the room. No one interrupted her, no one outmaneuvered her. So that moment of pause when Jasmine had laid out her legal logic with the weight of both experience and precedent stuck with her. The producers had invited both women back for a brief post-panel discussion set to air as bonus footage. Nothing formal, just an extra sit-down segment meant to feel casual off the cuff. But Judge Judy had no intention of being casual. This time she saw an opening, and she meant to use it. The cameras rolled again in a smaller studio, just down the hall. The setup was simple. 2 chairs, 1 camera, and a coffee table between them. No moderator, just the 2 of them. Judy looked over at Jasmine, so she began. We've talked about the Fourth Amendment surveillance and police conduct. But let's shift. What's your view on courtroom decorum? Because I'll be honest, I see a lot of young attorneys coming to courtrooms today thinking, emotion replaces preparation. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. Are you asking if passion gets in the way of the law? I'm asking if it's professional. Judy said law isn't therapy. The courtroom isn't a place for social commentary. Jasmine gave a small nod. It's not therapy, she agreed, but it is human, and justice is supposed to involve real people, not just case numbers. I've seen judges snap at defendants for crying during sentencing, but smile when prosecutors misquote evidence. That's not decorum, that's imbalance. Judy tilted her head. You think emotion has a place in the courtroom. I think truth has a place. Jasmine said. And sometimes truth comes with emotion. I've delivered closing arguments holding a mother's eviction notice in one hand and a sheriff's order in the other. If you can read those documents and feel nothing, you're not impartial. You're numb. That wasn't the angle Judy was hoping for. She leaned forward, voice tighter now. But you still have to respect the structure. The rules exist for a reason. Of course, Jasmine replied, but sometimes structure becomes a shield. I once had a judge tell me to watch my tone because I quoted a police transcript that included the word boy used against my client. You know what that meant? In that context, we both do. There was a pause. Judy's expression didn't change, but her fingers tapped lightly on the coffee cup in front of her. I remember that Jasmine added, almost offhandedly. That moment, that tone in the room, I remember thinking, if I stay quiet, I'm complicit. If I speak up, I'm emotional. So I did both. I filed a formal complaint, and I kept showing up. Judge Judy exhaled quietly. You know, she said, you're not what I expected, and you're not as inflexible as I thought, Jasmine replied with a soft smile. The conversation stretched another 20 minutes, touching on prosecutorial discretion, mandatory minimums, and even how social media had reshaped courtroom narratives. But the tension from earlier had shifted. There was still disagreement, plenty of it, but it didn't feel like a fight anymore. It felt like two people on opposite sides of a chasm, trying at least to understand the width of it. The cameras cut. The producer gave a thumbs up. Judge Judy stood first. She didn't say much, just looked over at Jasmine and said, "You're a sharp one. I'll give you that. Appreciate that." Jasmine said, "Coming from you, that means something." They shook hands, not a photo. Op handshake, a real one, firm, wordless, mutual. But outside the studio, in the public square. The moment had already caught fire, and the reaction was far bigger than anyone inside that room could have predicted. It started with a single tweet. A law student from UT Austin clipped the portion of the panel where Jasmine dissected United States v. Jones and posted it with the caption, "Judge Judy tried to test Jasmine Crockett on federal law. Guess who walked away with the mic?" Within an hour, it had over 200,000 likes. By noon, the clip had been stitched into TikToks, remixed on Instagram, and uploaded by major political commentary channels. On YouTube, some people shared it for the shock factor. Others reposted it with breakdowns and legal reactions. But what made it spread wasn't just the tension. It was Jasmine's calm, collected delivery, and that one sharp line that echoed across every platform: legal decisions don't change lives unless someone stands in that courtroom and says, "This is what the Constitution promises," and you can't ignore it. Just because he's poor or scared or inconvenient for every person who cheered her on, there was someone who'd never heard a congresswoman speak like that before, without jargon, without talking points, just plain language and courtroom scars. Then the think pieces came. The Dallas Morning News ran a column titled "Jasmine Crockett," reminded us what the law is for. The Los Angeles Sentinel published a follow-up story about her earlier cases, including interviews with two former clients who hadn't spoken to the press before one of them. Now a father of three and a contractor in Fort Worth said simply, "She saw me. I don't think people understand what that means." When no one else does, by nightfall cable news caught on a CNN legal analyst called the exchange a watershed moment for how we view legal credibility and generational voices over on Fox. A host half dismissed her as another politician using courtroom stories for political points, but even he had to admit she knows her stuff. Meanwhile, Jasmine didn't post anything, not a tweet, not a comment. She went silent on social media, not out of strategy, but because she had a backlog of constituent emails to get through, and a school board meeting to attend in Oak Cliff the next day. But the silence only added fuel to the fire. The public filled the space she left. Teachers shared clips with their government classes. Law school professors built the exchange into their constitutional law. Lectures a local bar association in Arizona even invited her to keynote a conference under the title "Grace Under Fire, Speaking Truth," without a gavel. And then came Judge Judy's response. It wasn't a statement. No press release, just a 5-minute phone interview with a radio host in San Diego who asked about the panel exchange. Judy didn't backpedal, didn't compliment excessively, but she did say this. She's articulate, grounded, knows her case law better than most lawyers. "I've seen at her age, I challenged her because I challenge people who I think have something to prove." She didn't flinch. I respect that. The internet ran with it. Articles framed it as Judy softening or endorsing Jasmine. But for those who watched the clip, it didn't feel like surrender. It felt like a passing of the torch. Even if neither woman said it aloud, one clip in particular stood out among the noise. It wasn't from the panel or the post discussion. It came from a young woman sitting in the fourth row of the live audience who had recorded on her phone and quietly uploaded it with no editing, no caption, just raw audio and video in it. You could hear Jasmine speaking calm and clear as the crowd listened, not to cheer or boo, but to understand. Then at the end, you heard something small, a voice near the camera, a woman maybe in her late 50s, whispering to no one in particular, "That girl's gonna change something." I felt that the comment section under that clip exploded, and for the first time in a long time, a national debate about legal practice, public perception, and generational difference wasn't just about outrage or scandal. It was about someone showing what expertise looks like when it's earned, not handed, and doing it without raising her voice. But while the online world buzzed, Jasmine remained focused, and what she did next proved this moment wasn't a peak. For her, it was only the beginning of something deeper. 2 days after the panel aired, Jasmine Crockett stood in a modest community center in Duncanville, Texas, surrounded by folding chairs, church fans, and a room full of locals, mostly teachers, retirees, and working-class folks who had shown up for her monthly town hall. There was no press, no photographers, just a dry erase board behind her that read, "Know Your Rights" in smudged blue marker. She barely mentioned the panel. In fact, it wasn't until a retired bus driver raised his hand. During Q&A that it even came up. "I saw you on that show with the TV judge," he said, grinning. "You got her good." There was scattered laughter. Jasmine smiled politely. It wasn't about getting anyone. It was about making sure the truth wasn't drowned out by authority. Then she went right back to business, updating the room on a new rental assistance bill, breaking down how to apply for broadband subsidies, and fielding a question from a single mother about school zoning, because that's how she moved. Spotlight or not, her rhythm didn't change. But the world around her had shifted. That same morning, her office fielded more than 800 emails from across the country, most of them from young lawyers, law students, and Black women who had seen the clip and written. Just to say thank you, one email stood out. It was from a civil rights attorney in Minnesota who wrote, "I've been in courtrooms for 22 years. You said what I felt for 2 decades, but never had the platform to say out loud. Another message came from a high school senior in Omaha. I want to study law because of you. You made it make sense, you made it feel possible." Meanwhile, back in Washington, things were picking up steam. Jasmine was invited to speak at a legal equity summit in Phoenix, hosted by the American Bar Foundation. A state senator from Ohio requested a private meeting to discuss possible collaboration on a statewide sentencing reform initiative. Even a few Republicans quietly reached out to say they admired how she handled herself. But none of that seemed to change her pace instead of flying to New York. To appear on morning shows, she chose to speak at a legal aid fundraiser in El Paso that she'd committed to months ago. The organizers hadn't expected a national name to keep the date, but Jasmine didn't cancel. She stood behind a podium in a room that smelled faintly of cafeteria pizza and floor polish, and told a story about her first eviction case, about how the tenant had been too scared to show up, and how the landlord's lawyer tried to win by default. She won the case. She told them not by yelling, not by shaming, but by showing the judge the paperwork and letting the law speak. Real wins don't always look good on camera. She said that night. But they matter back in Dallas. Local news caught wind of the viral moment and tracked down a few of her former clients for reaction pieces. Most declined. One agreed on the condition that his name not be used. "She got me out when I was stuck. I didn't think she even remembered me," he told the reporter. "She looked me in the eye when no one else would. She could have walked away. But she stayed." Meanwhile, Judge Judy returned to her own studio routine. No grand response, no follow-up show. She continued filming her new courtroom series, interacting with litigants ruling on cases. When asked by a production assistant how she felt about the media frenzy, she reportedly shrugged and said, "The law is a long game. If Crockett keeps showing up, people will see." That was as close to a blessing as anyone would get from her. But Jasmine didn't need a blessing. She had already been invited to give a guest lecture. At Texas Southern's law school, she accepted. And when she walked into that classroom full of first-year students a week later, she didn't talk about viral videos or Judge Judy. She started with, "Here's what happens when you don't object fast enough during voir. Dyer learned from my mistake," because for Jasmine, Crockett credibility wasn't built on moments. It was built on repetition, responsibility, and remembering why you started. But one final moment still lingered, a quiet exchange, far from cameras, that would bring the story full circle. It was nearly 2 weeks after the panel when Jasmine received a handwritten letter in her office mail, postmarked from Stamford, Connecticut. The envelope was plain, no return address, but the writing was familiar. The script was neat. Deliberate, old school. Inside was a single sheet, cream-colored, "No header, Congresswoman." That was one of the sharpest courtroom arguments I've witnessed, outside of an actual bench. "You were clear, measured, and most importantly, correct. You didn't come to perform. You came prepared. That's rare these days." Don't waste time proving yourself to people who've already decided you're not enough. Keep showing up anyway. The law needs more voices like yours. JS, no fanfare, no flattery, just a simple acknowledgement. But Jasmine read it twice, then folded it carefully and slid it into the back of her notebook, right behind a print out of United States v. Jones, which she still carried with her for workshops and town halls. That letter didn't change her. It didn't need to, because the real takeaway from everything that had happened, the viral moment, the online debates, the applause, even the quiet handshake with Judge Judy, was never about who won. It was about how you carry truth when the world expects something else. And Jasmine had learned, long before cameras ever found her, that you don't fight power with noise. You fight it with clarity, with calm, with repetition, with patience, and sometimes with silence that speaks louder than shouting. It wasn't about embarrassing someone on a stage. It wasn't about going viral. It was about reminding people that the law doesn't belong to judges or legislators or influencers. It belongs to the people. And when they understand it, when they see themselves in it, they stop being afraid of it. That's the part that stuck in interviews. Weeks later, when asked what she thought the public took away from the panel, Jasmine would answer the same way every time. I hope they saw that knowing the law, really knowing it, isn't about sounding smart, it's about being useful. Because if the people who need it most can't use it, what good is it? And those words resonated far beyond Dallas. Community centers began asking her for legal basics. Workshop civil rights organizations started distributing digestible summaries of constitutional protections. Inspired by the format she used on the panel, a few schools even invited her to speak, not about Congress or politics, but about how to argue with dignity and facts. Somewhere in the buzz, someone created a t-shirt with her. Quote in bold print, "The law is only as impartial as the people who enforce it." She laughed when she saw it. Not because it was wrong, but because it was strange after all these years, to see something she'd once said quietly in a courtroom become a rallying point. But through it all, she kept her rhythm. She still answered constituent calls herself. Every Friday morning, still showed up to committee meetings with a highlighter-streaked binder, still drove herself to Saturday neighborhood cleanups in South Dallas, even when it meant wearing boots over slacks. Because moments fade, but consistency doesn't, and that's where her power lived. Not in going viral, but in showing up when there's no one around to clap, in speaking plainly when everyone else performs, in treating a mother facing eviction with the same respect she'd give a Supreme Court justice. The lesson wasn't about winning debates. It wasn't even about changing minds. It was about being steady enough to remind people what fairness looks like when they've almost forgotten. But before we close, there's one more thing worth remembering. Because if stories like this matter to you, if hearing voices that speak with honesty, courage, and clarity feels rare, then make sure you don't miss the next. Weeks passed, the online buzz mellowed into something more meaningful. Conversation not just about Jasmine Crockett or Judge Judy, but about how we define credibility, how we value experience, and whether grace under pressure still matters. In a world obsessed with conflict, for Jasmine, life didn't shift into fame, it settled into something quieter but more lasting. Trust from strangers who watched that panel and saw someone who didn't blink under pressure. Trust from students who finally saw a legal mind, who looked and spoke like someone they knew, and trust from everyday people who'd stopped believing their voices mattered until someone reminded them they do. She didn't seek a spotlight. She simply carried her work into the light. And that's the thing about moments like this. They're not the end of a journey. They're just proof that someone's been walking with purpose all along. The lesson here isn't complicated. It's not about who's louder, older, or more established. It's not about winning the internet or scoring political points. It's about showing up with your full story, about using the weight of what you've seen, not to crush others, but to steady your voice. It's about knowing that real authority doesn't need to shout. It just needs to show, because there will always be rooms where you're underestimated, conversations designed to rattle you, people waiting for you to slip. But when you're grounded in truth, when your experience isn't borrowed or polished but earned, no one can take that from you. So, whether you're in a courtroom, a classroom, a boardroom, or just trying to speak up in a meeting where your voice feels ignored, remember what Jasmine showed that day. You don't have to fight loud. You just have to fight smart. And when someone questions if you belong at the table, don't argue. Show them why you do. Because clarity always cuts through. Now, if this story meant something to you, if it sparked a feeling, a memory, a moment of reflection, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story. That reminds you of what's possible when someone shows up prepared and unshaken. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that staying calm doesn't mean staying silent, and most importantly, leave a comment. Tell Tell us, when was the last time you saw someone surprise a room? Not by being louder, but by being ready. Your voice matters here. Let's keep the conversation going.